going to look at some 24/7 Sports SEC post-spring power rankings. Let's throw it up. I'm going to go through the list here. As you see, the Gators coming at number 11. Too high? Too low? What do you think? But number 1 is Georgia, no surprise there. Texas is number 2, no surprise. And then you start grouping some teams together where, all right, you can start maybe throwing them in a hat and picking them out, and you'd be okay. You'd be okay with Ole Miss, Alabama, or LSU at 3. But Ole Miss comes in at 3, Alabama at 4, LSU at 5. Alabama with the coaching change, of course. I mean, Texas coming into the SEC. Their first year in the SEC, they're already being power ranked at number 2. No issue with that whatsoever. Missouri at number 6. Tennessee 7. Oklahoma at 8. Texas A&M 9. Auburn at 10. Florida 11. Kentucky at 12. South Carolina comes in at 13. 14 is Arkansas. 15 is Mississippi State. And 16 is Vanderbilt. So the 2 newcomers, Texas at number 2, Oklahoma at 8. Don't forget, 16 teams now. It took me a half a second when I saw the article, and it starts with the highest ranking, but 16 besides Vanderbilt. Yeah. You know what? There's 16 teams now here in the SEC. But I'll go through some explanations of these teams that Brad Crawford put out on 24/7 Sports. And we will start at the highest ranking there with Vanderbilt. He says there's no need to pile on. Clark Lee might have the toughest power conference job in the country, leading Vanderbilt team playing opponents with talent advantages every week during league play. That's why he's mostly still got to read this. That's mostly why he's 2-22 in the SEC over his first 3 years in Nashville. One of those 2 wins is Billy Napier a couple seasons ago, unfortunately. He's a bright football mind and took it upon himself this offseason to make wholesale changes on his staff, bringing in New Mexico State's Tim Beck to call the offense, along with their quarterback there, Diego Pavia. He arrives in the summer. Clark Lee will handle defense on his own. So Lee previously served, of course, as Notre Dame's defensive coordinator before arriving at Vanderbilt, so he knows what he's doing there. Whether the Commodores execute will determine if 2024 is successful or a wash. Mississippi State, Florida does play them this year, of course. And as we go through this is the first opponent, of course. We're working backwards here. But Florida will play number 1, number 2, number 3, number 5, number 7, number 9, number 12, and number 15 in the SEC. That is crazy. Play 1, 2, and 3. And 5, of course. So Florida will play 4 of the top 5 teams in the power ranking here on 24/7 Sports. Georgia, Texas, Ole Miss, and LSU. So about Mississippi State here, of course, this was Florida's first road game. Jeff Levy promises an explosive offense in Starkville during his tenure, said Brad Crawford. But expecting everything to come together for this program in year 1 might be asking too much. Like most first-year coaches slipping a roster, Levy went transfer portal heavy to try and field a competitive group and players that fit his system. Brought in some big play threats at receiver to help ex-Baylor quarterback Blake Shapen. They want to make sure he has time to throw. Nearly every starter along the offensive line is new to the program, and the same goes for the defense up front. Remember, they were really experienced up front on the defense last year, was Mississippi State. So they lose a whole slew of experience along the defensive front. But there we go. Florida's first road game, Mississippi State, might be playing ex-Baylor quarterback Blake Shapen. They're going to open up that offense, of course. Jeff Levy coming from Ole Miss there in Lane Kiffin. Of course, UCF years ago as well. But really changed their style after Mike Leach passed away. Changed head coaches for whatever reason. Had Rodgers there, completely changed the offense to a more run approach or more balanced offense instead of keeping with the air raid. Really ruined Mississippi State last year. Now have another new head coach in Jeff Levy. So Florida's had trouble, of course, in Starkville in years past. Last time there, though, Dan Mullen getting a win over his former team in 2018. But historically, been a pretty tough spot there for Florida. I won't, for sake of time, I won't say much about Arkansas. Of course, we don't play Florida. Doesn't play them this year. Did beat Florida last year in the Swamp, of course. But just quick highlight: nearly half of the Razorbacks starting 22 will be transfers there for Sam Pittman. Of course, he's on the somewhat hot seat. That Florida win last year may have saved his job. Of course, bringing in Bobby Petrino at OC, transfer quarterback Taylon Green. KJ Jefferson leaves to go to UCF. We'll play Florida again this year. So Arkansas got a lot to work out there for Sam Pittman. In a year, he's probably fighting for his job. Number 13, of course, South Carolina. As you can see, they're anxious to see if their offensive line improves. Florida does not play them this year as well. Got to get used to that. Not playing. There's no SEC East, no SEC West. So don't play South Carolina this year. Don't play Vanderbilt this year. A lot of that to do with how tough Florida's schedule is this year. But you don't play the number 16 team in Vanderbilt like you should play or used to playing. Don't play number 13, South Carolina there. So, of course, going through quarterback change, Lenore Sellers, they're really excited about him at quarterback, but have to replace first-round pick Xavier Leggett there at receiver. But there we go. Juice Wells, another receiver, left for Ole Miss. So got to replace weapons, got to replace their quarterback. But they're really excited about Lenore Sellers. Of course, Florida got Pup Howard from him. They were banking on him to be a key piece in their defense. So South Carolina really got hit by transfer portal departures this past year. We'll see how they make up for it. Coming in at 13th on the power rankings. So, of course, next, and we do play this team, and this is kind of where, I talk about it. I would not have an issue if you put Kentucky ahead of Florida. Now, I know that might be blasphemy right here on a Gators podcast, but let's think about it. 3 straight wins over Florida. No matter what quarterback play has looked like, they have found a way to beat Florida. So, Kentucky, as Brad Crawford says, should be one of the SEC's faster teams on offense with Berrien Brown and Dane Key coming back. Of course, they lose Ray Davis, thankfully, to the NFL, along with a pair of impact starters on defense. Mark Stoops is satisfied with both of those areas as the players he has picked to assume those roles coming out of spring. Georgia quarterback, of course, Brock Vandergriff comes in, and Bush Hamden now is the OC. So we'll see how that, and another OC change at Kentucky this year. So the strength of this Kentucky team, says Brad, should be at the line of scrimmage where a bunch of veterans anchor both sides. So Kentucky coming in at number 12, one spot behind Florida, and our Gators are number 11. Now, you'll like what Brad says here. This team has one of the better quarterback rooms in the conference with Graham Mertz returning and talented 5-star DJ Lagway behind him. The offense should be better since most of those guys up front played last season. Ricky Pearsall is an obvious threat to replace, but that means more targets for rising sophomore Eugene Wilson. Losing 2 of their best players, running back Trevor Etienne and edge Princeton Uman Mielen was a brutal blow. I can't talk right now. Florida's schedule is so difficult this season that this could be a 6-win team and still be better than a team or 2 that finishes ahead of the Gators in the SEC. Now, look, this is a power ranking. Schedule should not come into play here. I don't know how much you've factored in the schedule in some of this. But for me, you don't factor in schedule in a power ranking. So that's why I'd have a little bit of issue. Let me know if you agree with what Brad had to say there, of course. So certainly agree with him about one of the better quarterback rooms in the SEC there with Mertz and Lagway. But yes, Ricky Pearsall is the obvious threat to replace. Yes, Eugene Wilson will get more targets. Can you put more help around him at the receiver spot? Will guys show up to take some of the burden off of Wilson? But yeah, it should be a blow. Like Florida would be better if they had Trevor Etienne. And I still say would be better if they had Princeton Uman Mielen. Now, some guys can certainly show up. That's not to say some guys won't, but I still think Florida would be a better team with those guys on the roster. But yes, it is a difficult schedule. But in power ranking, this is where I'll go. I'm gonna disagree with it. I would not have Auburn in front of Florida or Kentucky. As I said, I could put Kentucky ahead of Florida right now. So I would slot Auburn back to number 12. And a lot of the issue here is, and I will agree with Brad, is the quarterback spot. Just mention how good Florida's quarterback room is. That would, now Hugh Freeze, probably a better head coach than Billy Napier at this point. What he did at Ole Miss, what he did at Liberty, he's done it at 2 programs now, albeit, of course, we know the cheating stuff at Ole Miss, but still, has proven if you give him some talent, he can win with it. But at this point, I would still put Florida ahead of Auburn, mainly because of the quarterback spot. Does Hugh Freeze have a difference maker at quarterback? Asked Brad Crawford. Judging by spring practice, that answer's up in the air. The Tigers have not taken a quarterback in the transfer portal. Awfully surprising considering last season's up and down play through the year from Peyton Thorne. He didn't separate from the quarterbacks there and during camp, and Freeze said this month the competition will extend into fall camp. They put really good receivers around the quarterback. So you'd like to see more confidence in one of the possible QB1 options on the Plains. So given all those questions right there, yes, I would slot Auburn behind Florida and Kentucky. Auburn would be my number 12 team in the in the power rankings. So that would move, Florida up to number 10. Or keep Florida at 11 if you put Kentucky in front of Florida. But I'm even going to question putting Texas A&M that high. Now, I like Mike Elko. I think it was a really good hire for him, for Texas A&M. But coming into the SEC and that schedule, I think it's going to be pretty difficult to come in right away. Now, Elko did really good things at Duke in his first season there, but I think it's going to be a little bit different in the SEC. Of course, Florida's first SEC game this coming up season, coming to the Swamp in week 3. He says about Texas A&M, despite the coaching carousel resulting in a mass transfer exodus for the Aggies, Mike Elko and his staff worked overtime in filling positions with portal signings of their own and coming out of spring. Texas A&M looks like a team capable of earning a spot in the preseason top 25. Connor Wegman is a potential first-round pick at quarterback in 2025, while Purdue edge Nick Scorton, unblockable this spring, looks the part, covers up the loss of Walter Nolan. So former Florida linebacker Scooby Williams slides into a starting role, and there's a half dozen other transfers on defense who have made a splash over the last few weeks. Now, maybe Mike Elko can do more with Scooby Williams than Scooby Williams can do at Florida, but that is not something I'd be banking on. I don't know he makes Texas A&M any better. Now, Scooby can be a serviceable player. I think he's got to have help around him. He was an okay player with Shamar James beside him. But once he became the guy, he wasn't the guy. But the underperforming, look, Florida's underperformed as well. But the underperforming of Texas A&M the last couple of years certainly weighs in to this. But with the coaching change, I wouldn't have an issue if you put Florida and Kentucky above Texas A&M. And I have no issue with them really being where they're at. I mean, it's a hard team to figure out. Yes, they're getting hit by the transfer portal. There's still a lot of talent on the roster. But that's a team that's very polarizing coming into the SEC this year. So I probably would slide them behind Florida and Kentucky. Probably. So that would put Florida at 9 or 10 if you want to flip Florida and Kentucky. I have a hard time deciding that. At some point, I can see Florida being better than Kentucky, but right now, I have a hard time putting Florida above Kentucky given what has happened on the field the last few years. All right, let's go through this, wrapping it up. I wanted to go around the teams, I think, right around Florida. in these rankings. Why I think Florida could be above, maybe should stay put, but I would drop Auburn for sure below Florida and Kentucky. So, yeah, I would have Florida top 10 in the SEC out of 16, not where we want to be. Certainly not where we want to be. But I'd have Florida in the top 10 of the SEC. Now, our expectation is to be a top 10 in the country, not in the SEC. Hopefully, getting there soon. But that's not anywhere near where we're at right now. Oklahoma, won't go too much into there. We don't play them this year. So number 7 is Tennessee. It's always nice to have 2 of the top players in the SEC starting on each side of the ball, and that's the situation Josh Heupel was in with the Vols, says Brad Crawford. Assuming Nico Amialeva, hope I said that right, is the real deal at quarterback, and James Pierce has another disruptive season on defense, Tennessee should make moves. The secondary could be worrisome since much of it's brand new, and there are heightened expectations on a budding group of running backs to assist Amialeva and make things easy on the first-year starter. Now, I might flip Tennessee and Missouri, but that really does depend on Nico being the hype train that's behind him right now. But for Missouri, Brad says, some teams crumble with more exposure while others thrive in the limelight. Which way would the Tigers head this fall under Eli Drinkwitz? Most starters on offense return, including quarterback Brady Cook and all-world playmaker Luther Burton. But, of course, they lose SEC's leading rusher Cody Schrader. And then on defense, 3 dependable defensive backs were NFL draft picks over the weekend, along with the team's top pass rusher. And then they lose DC Blake Baker to LSU. So, yeah, I would have Tennessee above Missouri, but splitting hairs probably. All right, so let's go top 5. One more Florida opponent, LSU. This should be a competitive, if not elite, team for Brian Kelly in his 3rd season at LSU. However, it is understandable to question college football playoff hopes after losing 3 first-rounders on offense. Heisman winner J.T. Daniels, and of course, those receivers, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. LSU, as I spoke about it earlier with C.J. Daniels, they feel like they've reloaded in those spots via the transfer portal. But that's an optimistic viewpoint. I mean, those are really good receivers they will not be easily replaceable. Several all-conference hopefuls are back on the offensive line. Linebacker Harold Perkins leads a defense that is possible top 5 selection in 2025. They got to get that side of the ball fixed too, just like Florida. Now, they had a more explosive offense last year to help make up for it and lose only 3 games with that bad of a defense. Still have Harold Perkins. Can they get first-year Harold Perkins instead of last year Harold Perkins? As I said, Blake Baker, the DC at Missouri, comes over and is the defensive coordinator at LSU now. But certainly a lot of questions. On that side of the ball, one more time for LSU. They should be improved. But, man, they still got a ton of secondary questions, just like they had last year. So, about Alabama here, that's the team that's number 4 here. It's likely unsafe to doubt Alabama under Kalen DeBoer, given his track record of past success as a head coach. But this pressure cooker is a bit different in the SEC. The Crimson Tide appear to be in great hands at quarterback, despite losing 5-star signee Julian Sayin to Ohio State, and defensively could potentially absorb the loss of Caleb Downs too. The offensive line should be a strength, and the ground game will blossom with Justice Haynes and Jam Miller getting more reps as featured options. A couple players Alabama staff should be excited to see this fall include Washington transfer wideout Jeremy Bernard, along with freshman defensive backs Jalen Mbwake and Xavier Brown. So, Alabama, new coach, Wilt goes on there. DeBoer comes into Washington, success right away, plays the national championship in year 2 last year, makes his way to Alabama. Now, one more team that will be visiting the Swamp, number 3, Ole Miss. On paper, this Ole Miss roster looks like a group with a playoff berth on the horizon. Lane Kiffin essentially drafted a new defense ahead of the 2024 season after seeing what Alabama and Georgia did to the Rebels up front. There's 6 starters on defense from the portal, including Nolan Uman-Mielen and Arkansas linebacker Chris Poop Hall. Toss in a couple new running backs, ex-Gamecocks star Wells and 3-headed monster returning offensively of Jackson Dart, Trey Harris, and Jordan Watkins, and this group is loaded. Just imagine if they had Quinshon Judkins and he stayed another year in Oxford and not left for the Buckeyes. Well, that's the question for Ole Miss, right? Question is, can they win those big games? They're at a spot now where they're up underneath Bama, underneath Georgia, but can't quite jump over those teams. Now, in an expanded college football playoff, they could probably still get in. And now maybe other teams pick off Georgia or pick off teams you would perceive to be better than them, and they kind of work their way through it. But that's the next step for this team. They play Georgia again. They come to the Swamp in November. You know, they got some big games. It's very reminiscent of Dan Mullen and Florida coming out of 2019. Remember the 2 losses Florida had that year? The only 2 losses were Georgia and LSU. 2020 was supposed to be about taking that next step. Lane Kiffin here in a similar situation. Now has the benefit, one more time, of an expanded college football playoff. But can they get past the big teams? Another team, of course, the Gators will go on the road the week after they play Georgia and go to Texas. Steve Sarkisian knew much of his skill talent was gone for the NFL draft and put a plan in place for the Longhorns. 3 new starting wideouts all came via the transfer portal, including the coveted Isaiah Bond from Alabama. Texas needed a standout edge rusher and landed UTSA's Trey Moore and one of the group of 5 sack leaders in 2023. Anthony Hill might be the nation's most athletic sophomore linebacker, and he's primed for a nationally relevant campaign. The Longhorns' first season in the SEC should be special, and Quinn Ewers or Arch Manning have not been mentioned yet. Now, you don't have to mention Arch Manning because Quinn Ewers is and should be the starting quarterback. But if anything happens there, Arch Manning, of course, waiting in the wings. Interesting game for Florida, of course, going to Austin. Should be great atmosphere. Be those Texas fans' first time seeing Florida in Austin. And for Florida to be the week after playing number 1 SEC power-rated Georgia. Georgia has a conference championship to win after seeing its unbeaten season nullified by Alabama in Atlanta. The nucleus of that team is back, but not everyone. Carson Beck at quarterback, 5 senior starters on defense, and the additions of Florida running back ETN, Miami's Kobe Young at the X, and Vanderbilt's London Humphreys at the Y wideout spot makes this team formidable once again. Georgia's schedule is brutal. Hey, that's for change. But no drop-off is expected under Kirby Smart. And don't get me wrong, I think they would have handled pretty much any schedule you threw at them the last few years, but it is nice to see, even though no Texas A&M on the schedule in the next couple of years, but nice to see, them having to play Alabama in the regular season. Of course, they got to play Ole Miss as well. So probably will be more tougher this year than next year. But still, Georgia should be the number 1 team in the country. They've earned it. They would be my number 1 team. They'd be probably my pick to win the national title next year. But still nice to see them have to play a bit tougher schedule than normal, than the last few years. It's not a shot at Georgia. It's just a shot at the schedule. As I said, they probably go undefeated anyway, most of those years. They probably still win back-to-back titles, a couple seasons ago.